Jack Peterson stood over the sink, his hands moving swiftly through the pile of dishes stacked high from the dinner rush. The clatter of pots and pans filled the air as he scrubbed away food remnants, his mind far away from the task at hand. Instead of soap suds and grease, he pictured himself behind the stove, chopping, sautéing, and creating dishes that would make people stop and savor every bite. Working in a high-end restaurant in New York City was a dream for most, but for Jack, it felt like a tease. As a dishwasher, he was surrounded by the smells of gourmet meals, but his hands never touched the food that went out to the customers. He longed to wear the white chef's coat, to be the one standing in front of the stove, commanding the kitchen like an artist with a canvas. But Jack didn't have the credentials. He hadn't gone to culinary school, and that's what kept him in the back, washing plates instead of cooking on them. Every night as he watched the chefs expertly prepare dishes, his dream of becoming a chef seemed both so close and yet so far away. One afternoon during a rare break between lunch and dinner, Jack found himself alone in the kitchen. The chefs had taken a brief moment to relax, and the kitchen was eerily quiet. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He looked around the kitchen, eyes landing on a few ingredients left out. Some fresh vegetables, a piece of fish, and a loaf of rustic bread. A sudden idea sparked in his mind. "Why not?" Jack whispered to himself, feeling a rush of excitement. He quickly grabbed the ingredients, his hands moving instinctively as he began to cook. He seared the fish in a hot pan, letting the skin get crispy while sautéing the vegetables in olive oil and garlic. He sliced the bread, toasting it to perfection, and placed everything together on a plate. The smell was intoxicating, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt like he was doing what he was meant to do. Just as he was about to take a bite, the kitchen door swung open. Jack froze. In walked David Turner, the head chef of the restaurant. David was a man in his late 40s, with sharp blue eyes and a graying beard. His reputation in the culinary world was legendary. Once known for his mastery of French cuisine, David had run Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris before coming to New York. But the restaurant had seen better days, and David's frustration with the modern food scene was no secret. Jack felt a jolt of fear run through him as David's gaze landed on the plate in front of him. "Who cooked this?" David asked, his voice low and stern. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. I did, chef," he stammered, his eyes dropping to the floor. David said nothing for a long moment, his face unreadable as he walked over to the counter. Jack stood frozen in place, his heart pounding. David picked up a fork, cutting a piece of the fish and tasting it slowly. Jack braced himself for a scolding. After all, he was just a dishwasher. What business did he have cooking in this kitchen? But instead of anger, Jack saw a flicker of something else in David's eyes. Interest. David took another bite, his expression still unreadable. "You cooked this during your break?" David asked, finally looking at Jack. "Yes, chef," Jack replied, feeling his palms sweat. I wanted to practice, and no one was in the kitchen, so I thought." David held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at the plate again, then back at Jack. "Not bad," David said, setting the fork down. "The seasoning is good, the fish is cooked well, but—" He paused, narrowing his eyes. "It's missing something." Jack blinked, taken aback by the critique. "What's missing, chef?" David stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You need to understand the balance. It's not just about cooking each element well. It's about how everything works together. The bread is too thick, it overwhelms the fish. The vegetables are fine, but they lack brightness. Next time, add a touch of acidity, maybe lemon or a splash of vinegar." Jack nodded, his mind racing. David had just given him advice, real advice. And for the first time, Jack felt like he wasn't just a dishwasher anymore. He was someone with potential. David gave him a long look, then turned to leave. "Clean up when you're done," he said over his shoulder, walking out of the kitchen. Jack stood there, staring at the door long after David had gone. His heart was still racing. But this time, it was from something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, his dream wasn't as far away as he thought. As he cleaned up the kitchen, Jack couldn't help but smile. David Turner, the famous chef, had noticed him, and that was more than enough to keep his dream alive. The next day, Jack arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. His mind was still racing from his brief encounter with Chef David Turner. He had spent the entire night thinking about it, replaying David's critique, imagining what it would be like to actually work under him. Jack had never thought he'd get that close to his dream so soon, and yet here he was with a glimmer of hope. When he entered the kitchen, David was already there, reviewing orders with his sous chefs. The bustling noise of chopping, frying, and clattering pans filled the space as the team prepared for the busy day ahead. Jack took his usual spot at the sink, unsure of what would happen next. He was half expecting David to forget their brief conversation entirely. But as the morning rush slowed down, David approached Jack, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You want to be a chef, right?" David asked, his tone more a statement than a question. "Yes, chef," Jack replied quickly, his heart skipping a beat. David crossed his arms, sizing Jack up. "You know, this is not a game. Cooking is an art, but it's also a craft. It takes discipline, precision, and dedication. Most people don't make it." Jack nodded, his excitement bubbling up. "I understand, chef. I'm ready to learn." David raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "We'll see about that," he said, turning toward the stove. "You'll start as my apprentice. That means you'll assist me in everything. You'll watch, you'll listen, and you'll follow my instructions exactly. Understood?" "Yes, chef," Jack said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. David gestured to the prep station. "Grab an apron. We'll see if you have what it takes." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly donned an apron and stepped into the role he had always dreamed of. The excitement in his veins was electrifying, until the reality of the kitchen set in. As soon as he started working alongside David, Jack realized something crucial. This wasn't going to be easy. David was an intense teacher. He expected precision, speed, and perfection at every turn. Jack's first task seemed simple, chopping vegetables for a salad, but under David's sharp gaze, his hands shook. "Not like that," David barked, pointing at Jack's uneven cuts. "Every piece should be the same size. If one piece is too big, the entire dish is ruined." Jack bit his lip, nodding as he started again. His fingers fumbled over the knife, trying to match the perfect cubes that David had demonstrated. His nerves were getting the better of him. "Stop! You're holding the knife wrong," David said, grabbing the knife from Jack's hand. "Like this." He demonstrated the correct grip, his hands moving fluidly, almost effortlessly. Jack tried to mimic him, but his cuts were still too rough. The rest of the day continued in a similar fashion. Jack struggled to keep up with David's high expectations. When he wasn't chopping vegetables wrong, he was over-seasoning a dish or moving too slowly during service. Each mistake earned him a sharp word from David, who didn't have time for patience in the high-pressure environment of a busy kitchen. "Faster, Jack! We don't have all day. That's too much salt. Are you trying to ruin the dish? Pay attention. You're not focusing." By the end of the day, Jack felt completely defeated. His hands were sore from gripping knives and pots all day, and his mind was spinning from David's constant corrections. He had imagined his first day as an apprentice being filled with excitement and progress. Instead, it was a never-ending stream of mistakes. As Jack wiped down the counters at the end of the shift, he wondered if he was really cut out for this. David had made it clear that there was no room for error in his kitchen, and Jack was making more than his share. David approached him again, this time his voice lower, less sharp. "You made a lot of mistakes today." Jack felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry, chef. I'll try harder tomorrow." David stared at him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, it's not about trying harder. This is a craft that takes time. You can't rush it, and you can't expect to be perfect right away. But if you don't learn from your mistakes, you won't make it." Jack nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "I will, chef. I want to get better." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. But understand this. If you don't improve, I won't waste my time." Jack felt a pit form in his stomach as David walked away. The words hung heavy in the air, a reminder that his dream could slip away if he didn't rise to the challenge. Over the next few days, the same pattern continued. Jack's excitement was slowly replaced by anxiety. Every mistake felt like another nail in the coffin of his dream. No matter how hard he tried, David's critiques were relentless. He corrected everything. Jack's knife skills, his seasoning, his timing. Nothing Jack did was ever good enough. One evening, after a particularly rough service, Jack sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the chopping board in front of him. His hands ached and his head throbbed from the pressure. He was starting to doubt whether he had what it took to survive in such a demanding environment. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," Jack muttered to himself. But then he remembered the taste of that first dish he'd made, the way David had noticed him, the spark of recognition in his eyes. Jack took a deep breath. It wasn't supposed to be easy, he reminded himself. If it were, everyone would be a chef. He had to push through the tough days, just like David had said. The next morning, Jack walked into the kitchen with renewed determination. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles aching after another grueling day in the kitchen. It had been weeks since he'd started as David's apprentice, and though he had learned a lot, the strain of living up to the head chef's expectations was wearing him down. Every mistake still felt like a personal failure, and the relentless pressure made him question his choices more than once. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jack's mind wandered back to the dishes he'd seen growing up. His family wasn't wealthy, and their meals were simple but flavorful. His grandmother, who had raised him, often used ingredients from the local farmer's market to make creative dishes that blended different cultures. Jack smiled to himself, remembering the joy of experimenting in the kitchen with her. Those meals had sparked his love for cooking. Why had he forgotten that? The next day, Jack entered the kitchen with a newfound determination. The usual tension filled the air, but something inside him felt different. As lunch service came and went, Jack busied himself with the prep work, quietly observing the dishes going out to the dining room. The plates were immaculate, but something felt distant, stale even. The same traditional French cuisine, perfected by David, but lacking the excitement that Jack had always associated with food. After the last customer left, David and the rest of the staff gathered for a brief break before dinner service. Jack, heart pounding, seized his moment. He glanced at the pantry, eyeing the fresh ingredients. "What are you doing?" came David's sharp voice from across the kitchen, startling Jack out of his thoughts. Jack turned, swallowing hard. I want to try something, chef." David raised an eyebrow, his arms crossed. "You want to try something? What do you mean by that?" Jack felt his face flush, but he didn't back down. "I was thinking, maybe we could try a new dish, something different, something modern." He hesitated, then continued, "I've been learning a lot from you, chef, but I'd like to experiment with some ideas of my own. Just for fun." David's eyes narrowed. "This is a fine dining restaurant, not your personal playground. We don't experiment with customers' food." Jack's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to give up. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "What if I make it after hours? Just one dish. If it doesn't work, I'll never bring it up again." David glared at Jack for a long moment, then finally shrugged. "Fine. After we close tonight, you can cook. But if you waste my time, you're done. Understood?" Jack nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. "Understood, chef." The rest of the evening felt like an eternity. Jack's mind raced with ideas as he worked through the regular service, his hands moving on autopilot. When the last customer left and the kitchen finally quieted, Jack's moment had come. With the restaurant empty, Jack gathered his ingredients. He had a vision, something that combined the elegance of French cuisine with the vibrant, bold flavors of modern fusion dishes. He started with a base of pan-seared salmon, perfectly cooked with crispy skin, just as David had taught him. But instead of the traditional accompaniments, Jack prepared a fresh mango and avocado salsa, mixed with lime juice and cilantro, adding a burst of color and brightness. For a side, he created a creamy polenta, topped with a drizzle of spicy honey. David watched silently from the corner of the kitchen, his arms crossed, skepticism etched across his face. Jack could feel the pressure mounting with every step, but he pushed through, determined to create something that would make his grandmother proud. After what felt like an eternity, the dish was ready. Jack carefully plated it, wiping the edges of the plate clean before presenting it to David. He stepped back, his heart racing as David approached the plate. For a long moment, David simply stared at it, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he picked up a fork and took a bite of the salmon, his eyes narrowing as he chewed. He moved on to the salsa, then the polenta, tasting each element in silence. Jack stood frozen, watching every twitch of David's face for a sign of approval or disapproval. Finally, David set the fork down. His brow furrowed, and for a moment Jack was sure he was about to get torn apart. But instead, David spoke in a low, thoughtful voice. "It's not bad." Jack blinked in surprise. "Not bad?" David gave him a sideways glance. "The flavors are bold, unexpected. The salsa brings freshness, and the polenta is balanced well with the honey. But," he paused, looking Jack directly in the eyes, "it's not traditional. This isn't French cuisine." Jack swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I know, chef. I wanted to try something new. I thought maybe customers would like it." David didn't respond right away. He simply looked down at the plate again, then took another bite of the polenta, a slow realization spreading across his face. Jack's stomach twisted in knots as he waited for the verdict. "I'll admit," David finally said, his voice quieter, "it's good. Different, but good." Before Jack could respond, the kitchen door creaked open. One of the servers peeked in. "Chef, a few customers are still at the bar. They're asking if we have anything new on the menu." David glanced at Jack, then back at the server. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a sharp nod, he pointed to Jack's dish. "Take them this," he said. Jack's eyes widened. "Wait, really? Chef, are you sure?" David didn't look at him. "I said take it to them. Let's see what they think." The server nodded, quickly taking the plate and disappearing out the door. Jack stood there, his heart pounding. He couldn't believe it. His dish was going out to real customers. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for feedback. Jack's palms were sweaty, and even David, normally composed and calm, seemed slightly on edge. Finally, the server returned with a wide grin. "They loved it, chef. They said it's one of the best things they've had here." David didn't smile, but Jack saw a faint glimmer of something in his eyes, something like approval. "We'll see if it lasts," was all David said, turning to the prep station. But Jack knew what that meant. For the first time, his creative ideas had been accepted. And slowly, over the next few days, things began to shift. Jack and David started working together, blending the old with the new. David's classic techniques provided the foundation, but Jack's modern twist began to breathe new life into the restaurant. Customers started coming in not just for the tried-and-true French dishes, but for the unique creations that combine tradition with innovation. As the weeks went by, the restaurant began to buzz with energy again. Word spread about the new dishes, and the reservation list grew longer. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he belonged in that kitchen, not just as an apprentice, but as a chef in the making. The restaurant was buzzing. Every table was filled with customers savoring dishes that were both familiar and innovative. The unique combination of David's traditional French techniques and Jack's modern twists had created a culinary renaissance. Word of mouth spread fast, and soon articles began to appear in local food magazines praising the old meets new style of the restaurant. Business was booming, and Jack's confidence grew with every plate that went out. One quiet afternoon, just as the kitchen was preparing for the evening shift, an envelope arrived. It was large, elegant, and embossed with the golden seal of the Culinary Masters competition, one of the most prestigious cooking contests in the country. Jack's eyes widened as he opened it. Inside was a formal invitation, addressed to David Turner and his team. "Chef, look at this!" Jack called out, his voice trembling with excitement. David looked up from his station, wiping his hands on his apron. "What is it?" "It's an invitation to the Culinary Masters competition," Jack practically shouted, unable to contain his enthusiasm. David walked over, took the envelope from Jack, and examined the letter inside. His face remained stoic as he read the words, but Jack could see the subtle flicker of something behind his eyes, an emotion he hadn't seen in David before. It was pride and fear. "This is huge, chef," Jack continued, his words tumbling out. "It's a chance to show everyone what we've been doing here, to showcase our unique style. We have to enter." David folded the letter carefully and placed it on the counter. His face hardened, the flicker of emotion quickly replaced by his usual calm exterior. "We're not going," he said flatly. Jack blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? This is the biggest competition in the country. It's exactly what we need to put the restaurant on the map." David shook his head. "It's not for us. Competitions like this are all about showmanship, flashy plating, and trendy dishes. That's not what we do here." Jack felt his heart sink. But chef, we've been doing something special. The combination of your traditional skills and the new ideas we've been working on together, it's what's making people come here. We could win this. David sighed, rubbing his temples. Jack, you don't understand. I've been in competitions before. The pressure, the scrutiny, they want something new, something different. My style, the classic French techniques, they're not what judges are looking for anymore. Jack frowned. But that's not all we do now, right? We've been blending the old and the new. If we go to this competition together, we can show them how tradition and innovation can work hand in hand. David stared at Jack, his jaw tight. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Jack held his breath, hoping, waiting for David to say something, anything that might suggest he was willing to take the risk. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and uncertain. You really think we could win? Jack nodded, his resolve strengthening. I do. We've been working together for weeks, and the restaurant has never been busier. We're on to something here, chef. You have the experience, and I can bring some fresh ideas to the table. We can do this. David looked away, his eyes distant as if weighing 1,000 thoughts at once. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll enter. Jack grinned, his excitement barely contained. You won't regret it, chef. The following weeks were a blur of preparation. The competition was only a month away, and Jack and David spent every spare moment perfecting their menu. They wanted to create something that would impress the judges, but stay true to their combined vision. The pressure was immense, and for the first time, Jack felt the full weight of what they were about to undertake. The kitchen became a battlefield of ideas. Jack's creativity clashed with David's discipline, and there were moments of intense frustration. One evening, after a particularly heated argument over the use of truffle oil in a sauce, Jack stormed out of the kitchen, his nerves frayed. This isn't going to work if you won't even consider new ideas, Jack shouted as he threw his apron down. David stood firm, his arms crossed. New ideas for the sake of being new isn't the point. You need balance, Jack. You need control. Jack clenched his fists, feeling the weight of David's words. And you need to be open to change, chef. We're not going to win this by playing it safe. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. But just as quickly as the argument had flared, it fizzled out. David sighed, the lines of exhaustion on his face suddenly visible. We'll figure it out, David said quietly, his voice softer than before. Jack nodded, his anger cooling. Yeah, we will. The day of the competition arrived, and the energy in the air was electric. The arena was packed with spectators, food critics, and some of the top chefs from across the country. Jack's stomach churned with nerves as they set up their station, glancing at the other teams who were preparing their dishes with practiced precision. David, on the other hand, appeared calm, though Jack could see the tension in the set of his jaw. They had worked tirelessly to perfect their menu. A starter of smoked duck breast with blackberry compote, a main course of seared scallops with a lemongrass beurre blanc, and a dessert of spiced chocolate mousse with a hint of chili. It was a blend of classic French technique and Jack's modern twists, a fusion of tradition and creativity. When the clock started, the kitchen erupted into action. Jack and David worked like a well-oiled machine, each movement precise, every step planned to perfection. For the first time, Jack felt the true power of their partnership. David's meticulous attention to detail, combined with Jack's bold creativity, was creating something special. But as the minutes ticked by, the pressure mounted. One misstep, one delay, and the entire dish could fall apart. Halfway through the competition, disaster struck when Jack accidentally overcooked a batch of scallops. We don't have time to make more! Jack panicked, his heart racing. David took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. We'll adjust. Use the ones we have, and we'll make the garnish stand out. Trust me. Jack nodded, his hands shaking as he followed David's lead. The final moments of the competition were a blur, but when the clock finally ran out, Jack stepped back, drenched in sweat but filled with a strange sense of pride. They had done it. As the judges tasted their dishes, Jack and David stood side by side, their hearts pounding in their chests. The wait was agonizing. When the head judge finally approached them, she smiled. Your use of tradition and innovation is remarkable, she said, her eyes twinkling. It's a difficult balance to strike, but you've done it beautifully. Jack's heart soared. They hadn't won the top prize, but the recognition alone was enough. David's face softened, a rare smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe you were right," David said, his voice low. Jack grinned, feeling a rush of pride. "Maybe we both were." The applause echoed through the competition hall as the winners were announced. Jack and David stood together, watching as another team took the top prize. They exchanged glances, a flicker of disappointment passing between them, but it was brief. Deep down, they both knew the competition had been about more than just winning. They hadn't come here for a trophy. They had come to prove something, not only to the judges, but to themselves. After the competition, as the teams gathered to mingle and celebrate, several well-known chefs approached Jack and David to offer their congratulations. Among them was the head judge, a highly respected figure in the culinary world. She smiled warmly at them, shaking their hands. "You two have something special," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "It's rare to see such a seamless blend of tradition and innovation. Keep at it, and you'll go far." Jack's heart swelled with pride. Hearing those words from someone so esteemed felt like winning in its own way. He glanced at David, who gave him a small nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a shared victory. As they left the competition, the chilly evening air hit Jack's face, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. The competition might not have brought them the first-place trophy, but it had given them something even more valuable: recognition, the kind that would open doors. David walked beside him, his hands in his pockets, his face contemplative but relaxed. For the first time in months, there was no tension between them, just a sense of mutual understanding. They had faced the challenge together, and they had grown from it. "You know," David said, breaking the silence, "I wasn't sure about all of this at first. I thought mixing modern ideas with my style would be a mistake." Jack looked at him, sensing there was more to come. "But you showed me something important," David continued. "Tradition doesn't have to be rigid. It can evolve, and I can evolve with it." Jack smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for the mentor standing beside him. "I've learned a lot from you too, Chef. I wouldn't have made it this far without your guidance." David chuckled softly. "Guidance? More like tough love," Jack laughed. "Maybe a bit of both." Back at the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted. The competition had brought new attention, and reservations were pouring in. Jack and David's reputation as a dynamic duo was spreading. Customers came in not just for the food, but for the story behind it. The story of a once traditional restaurant reborn through the partnership of an old-school chef and his ambitious apprentice. Their kitchen now thrummed with a new energy. Every service felt like a well-coordinated dance, with Jack and David working in perfect harmony. Jack's modern dishes, infused with flavors from around the world, stood proudly next to David's classic French creations, and together they created a menu that was both timeless and bold. David, once set in his ways, had learned to trust Jack's instincts. He began to appreciate the bursts of creativity that Jack brought to the table, finding joy in experimenting with new ingredients and techniques. At the same time, Jack grew to understand the value of discipline and precision. David's lessons on balance, restraint, and technique had shaped him into a more refined chef. The partnership that had started with skepticism had blossomed into something far deeper: friendship. One evening, after a particularly busy service, Jack and David sat together in the kitchen, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter from the dining room filtering through the doors. They were exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from knowing they had given their best. David took a sip of his coffee, glancing at Jack. "You've come a long way since you were washing dishes in the back." Jack grinned. "Feels like a lifetime ago." David leaned back, his eyes softening with the rare warmth of pride. "You've earned your place in this kitchen. You're not just an apprentice anymore. You're a chef." Jack's chest tightened at the words. It was the acknowledgement he had dreamed of, and hearing it from David made it all the more meaningful. "Thanks, Chef," Jack said, his voice quiet. "I couldn't have done it without you." David waved a hand dismissively. "You did most of it yourself. I just pushed you when you needed it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had shared hanging in the air. Jack had come into the restaurant as an eager dreamer, and now he was leaving his mark. But more importantly, He had gained a friend and mentor in David, something he hadn't expected but now couldn't imagine being without. As the restaurant's success grew, so did Jack's role within it. He started taking on more responsibility, creating new menu items, training new staff, and even representing the restaurant at culinary events. Customers began to ask for him by name, eager to try the latest creations from the rising star in the kitchen. But through it all, Jack never forgot where he came from, and he never stopped respecting the traditions that had shaped him. He continued to collaborate with David, always seeking his advice, always learning from the master who had taught him so much. One evening, after closing, Jack stood at the stove experimenting with a new sauce. David watched from the doorway, a cup of tea in hand. It had become a routine for them, David observing quietly while Jack worked, offering the occasional suggestion, but mostly letting Jack find his own way. "You know," David said after a while, "you're going to run this place one day." Jack looked up, startled. "What?" David smiled, a rare but genuine expression. "I'm not getting any younger. Someday I'm going to have to step back. When that time comes, I want you to take over." Jack was speechless. He had always dreamed of becoming a chef, but he had never imagined running the restaurant itself. I don't know what to say," David shrugged. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. But when the time comes, I know you'll be ready." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. The restaurant had been David's life's work, and now he was offering it to Jack. It was the ultimate sign of trust and friendship. As Jack stirred the sauce, his mind drifted to the future. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. With David by his side and the lessons he had learned guiding him, Jack's dream wasn't just a dream anymore. It was his reality, and it was only the beginning.